The image of a fighter jet sitting silent on a tarmac is perhaps the most potent symbol of failed statecraft we have seen in a generation. When you look at the headlines today, you see panic. You see reports of the United States Air Force grounding squadrons, of frantic meetings inside the Pentagon, and of a White House that seems completely blindsided by the reality of its own trade war. But I want to talk to you about what is actually happening beneath the noise of this diplomatic crisis. Because what we are witnessing isn't just a political spat between Washington and Ottawa. It is the catastrophic collision of nationalist fantasy with the hard material reality of global capitalism. For years, we have been sold a story that national security is something that exists within our borders. That military might is purely a product of American will and American funding. What Mark Carney just proved in a single devastating administrative move is that this story was a lie. The machinery of American empire does not run on will. It runs on supply chains. And right now, those supply chains have been snapped. You might be wondering how we got here. How does the most expensive, sophisticated military in human history get grounded by a neighbor we usually think of as our polite junior partner in trade? The answer lies in the specific mechanics of what Prime Minister Carney has actually done. By blocking the export of critical aerospace components and specialized metals, things like high-grade titanium alloys used in airframes, specific hydraulic systems for landing gear, and the micro-components essential for missile guidance, Canada has not just imposed a tariff, they have pulled the plug on the production line. This is what economists call a choke point. In our modern, hyper-efficient economy, we don't build stockpiles, we build dependencies. The F-35, the crown jewel of American air superiority, is not really an American plane in the way you might think. It is a North American plane. It is a global plane. Its existence depends on the seamless flow of parts, crossing the 49th parallel daily, sometimes hourly. When that flow stops, the assembly line doesn't just slow down, it dies. This is where the political narrative crumbles. Donald Trump promised you a restored military. He promised that a trade war would bring industry home and make America resilient. But the irony, and it's a dark, dangerous irony, is that his trade war has done the exact opposite. By antagonizing our closest economic ally, he hasn't strengthened our industrial base. He has exposed its fragility. We are seeing a complete collapse of maintenance schedules because the Department of Defense, for all its trillions in budget, operates on the same logic as a car manufacturer. They rely on just-in-time delivery. They assumed that Canada would always be there, that the border would always be open for defense goods. That assumption was the foundation of our readiness. Now that foundation is gone. I want you to think about what this means for the workers in those hangars and factories. We often talk about the economy in terms of stock markets or GDP. But the real economy is physical. It's bolts, circuits, and alloys. Right now, American mechanics are standing next to billion-dollar aircraft that cannot fly because a specific actuator or a specific alloy casting is sitting in a warehouse in Quebec or Ontario barred from export. This is the lesson that the administration failed to learn. You cannot bully the people who make the brakes for your car while you are driving down the highway at 100 meters an hour. Carney's move is a masterclass in leverage. He identified exactly where the US economy, and specifically the military-industrial complex, was most vulnerable, and he applied pressure there. It's not a broad tariff that hurts consumers at the grocery store. It's a targeted strike against the state's capacity to project power. This situation reveals a profound misunderstanding of how modern capitalism works. The administration treats trade like a zero-sum game between sovereign nations, like it's the 18th century. But the class reality is different. The defense sector is integrated. The capital is integrated. A labor force is in effect integrated across that border. When you disrupt that integration with blunt political instruments like tariffs or threats, you create chaos. And frankly, the Pentagon knew this. We are hearing reports that career officials have been warning about this for months. They know that the U.S. defense industrial base has hollowed out its domestic capacity for certain niche components because it was cheaper and more efficient to source them from specialized Canadian firms. This is the logic of the market: efficiency over resiliency. For decades, we chased the lowest cost and the highest efficiency, outsourcing critical steps in the supply chain to trusted allies. It worked great for corporate balance sheets. It worked great for keeping the headline cost of weapons programs slightly lower. But it created a hidden risk, a structural flaw that Mark Carney has just cracked wide open. So when you see the footage of grounded jets, I don't want you to just see a military problem. I want you to see an economic problem. I want you to see the failure of a worldview that thinks you can divorce politics from the physical reality of production. The White House is currently threatening to invoke the Defense Production Act, trying to legally mandate production. But here is the thing: American laws do not apply in Canada. You cannot legislate a foreign factory into obedience. This is the wall that the America First ideology has hit. You can scream and shout about sovereignty all you want, but if you don't control the raw materials and the intermediate components, you are not sovereign. You are dependent. And right now, the United States is learning exactly what it feels like to be on the receiving end of economic warfare, not from a hostile rival, but from a strategic partner who simply decided they had had enough. We need to dig deeper into the background of this, because it didn't happen overnight. This isn't just about one bad phone call or one specific tariff. This is the culmination of years of eroding trust and shifting economic plates. To understand why Carney pulled this lever and why now, we have to look at the pressure that was being applied to the Canadian economy and the class dynamics at play. We have to look at how the Trump administration's protectionist policies were threatening Canadian industries, essentially backing them into a corner where they felt they had no choice but to weaponize their position in the supply chain. It's a classic escalation, but one where the United States severely miscalculated its leverage. They thought size was power. They forgot that position is power. And in the intricate web of aerospace manufacturing, Canada holds a position that we cannot easily bypass. As we move forward in this analysis, I want to walk you through the specific mechanisms of this trade relationship and how it broke down. We are going to look at the incentives that drove us to this point of vulnerability and the frantic, likely futile attempts to fix it. Because if we don't understand the economic plumbing of this crisis, we are going to keep making the same mistakes. Whether it's with Canada, Europe, or Asia, the era of assuming American economic dominance guarantees military readiness is over. We are in a new reality now, one where supply chains are the battlefield, and right now, we are losing. To understand the gravity of this collapse, we have to look back at how the system was designed to work in the first place. Because the current crisis is essentially the violent unraveling of a 70-year-old economic pact. Since the 1950s, through the Defense Production Sharing Agreement, the United States and Canada effectively erased the border when it came to military manufacturing. This wasn't done out of charity or friendship. It was done for the benefit of American capital. It allowed the titans of the U.S. defense industry, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, to treat Toronto and Montreal exactly the same way they treated Chicago or Seattle. They could scour the continent for the cheapest, most specialized labor and the most efficient production facilities, regardless of which side of the border they sat on. This integration was so deep that for decades, the Pentagon didn't even classify Canadian contractors as foreign in the same way they did British or German ones. They were considered part of the domestic industrial base. This policy made a lot of defense contractors very rich, and it saved the US taxpayer money on the sticker price of weapons. But it created a singular, fatal dependency. It assumed that political relations between Washington and Ottawa would always be boring, stable, and subservient. That assumption died the moment the administration decided to treat trade policy like a reality TV feud. When Donald Trump slapped tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum and then threatened to tear up broader trade agreements, he wasn't just raising the price of a can of soup. He was throwing sand into the gears of a finely tuned continental military machine. You have to understand the arrogance required to do this. The White House operated on the belief that Canada needed us so desperately that they would just take the punishment, that the asymmetry in our economies meant they had no leverage. But as any economist who studies systems will tell you, leverage isn't just about size. It's about criticality. You can have a massive engine, but if you remove the spark plug, that engine is just a heavy block of useless metal. Canada produces the spark plugs. And this brings us to the specific mechanics of Mark Carney's retaliation, which is where the story gets truly interesting from a systemic perspective. Carney didn't launch a broad trade war. He didn't try to tax American milk or ban American cars, which would have hurt Canadian consumers. Instead, he looked at the supply chain maps. He identified the Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers, the specialized firms that make the niche components that US assemblers cannot easily source elsewhere. We are talking about companies that produce specific machined landing gear components for the F-35 or proprietary electronic connectors for radar systems. These aren't parts you can just buy off the shelf at a hardware store, and they aren't parts you can just spin up a factory in Ohio to make overnight. These facilities require specialized tooling, certified skilled labor, and months, if not years, of Pentagon qualification and testing. By placing these specific items on an export control list, essentially a do not sell list for national security reasons, Carney turned the bureaucracy of the state into a weapon. This is how modern economic warfare is fought. It's not about blockades at sea. It's about a customs officer in Ontario looking at a manifest, seeing a crate of high-pressure hydraulic valves destined for a Lockheed plant in Texas, and stamping denied on the permit. That crate stays on the dock. 2 days later, the assembly line in Texas stops. 3 days later, the Air Force is told their maintenance overhaul is delayed indefinitely. It is a quiet, bloodless, bureaucratic strangulation. Now, I want you to think about what this means for you. If you are a taxpayer, you are currently funding a military that cannot fly. We are pouring billions of dollars into these platforms. Money that could be going to healthcare, infrastructure, or education. And right now, that investment is sitting uselessly on the ground because of a political gamble that backfired. But it hits closer to home than just tax dollars. Think about the American workers in the defense supply chain. This is the hidden cost of the administration's bluster. There are small machine shops in the Midwest, logistics companies in the South, and tech firms on the West Coast that act as middlemen or final assemblers for these Canadian parts. When the parts stop coming, those American workers get sent home. their shifts get cut. The America First policy is literally idling American labor because it failed to respect the international nature of production. This exposes the fundamental contradiction in the nationalist economic narrative. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot enjoy the efficiency and low costs of a globalized supply chain while simultaneously acting like a belligerent isolationist. The market punishes that incoherence. And what we are seeing now is the market guided by a very shrewd political operator in Carney exacting that punishment. The Pentagon is currently scrambling to find alternative suppliers. But here is the cold reality of manufacturing. You cannot replace highly technical certified aerospace production in a week. It takes 18 to 24 months to certify a new supplier for critical flight safety parts. Do we have 24 months to wait for our fighter jets to be airworthy? The administration has effectively created a 2-year gap in our national defense capabilities because they wanted to score points on a tariff dispute. Furthermore, we have to look at the incentives that drove Carney to do this. It wasn't just revenge. It was a signal to the rest of the world. By demonstrating that Canada can paralyze the US military, Carney is rewriting the power dynamic. He is showing Europe, and perhaps more worryingly, he is showing China that the US giant has glass knees. He is signaling to Canadian capital that the state will protect them, even if it means playing hardball with their biggest customer. This is a massive shift in class relations within the North American bloc. Usually, the Canadian capitalist class is terrified of offending Washington. For them to support, or at least acquiesce to this move, suggests that the instability coming from the US has become a greater threat to their business interests than the risk of retaliation. They have calculated that the US is no longer a reliable partner. So they might as well use their leverage now to secure better terms or to pivot their business elsewhere. And they are pivoting. While our jets are grounded, Canadian firms are signing deals with Airbus, with SAE, with BAE Systems. They are integrating their supply chains into the European defense architecture. This is the long-term damage that the headlines miss. The immediate crisis is the grounded jets, but the permanent crisis is the loss of the industrial base. Once those supply lines shift to Europe, they don't just snap back to the US when the political winds change. We are witnessing a structural decoupling driven by our own incompetence. We are forcing our neighbors to build a future that doesn't include us, and we are doing it while we are still dependent on the things they make. It is frankly strategic suicide disguised as tough negotiating. We have to talk about the leadership, or rather the catastrophic failure of leadership that allowed this to happen. When you strip away the tweets and the rallies, the job of the president is fundamentally to be the risk manager for the United States. And in this case, Donald Trump didn't just fail to manage the risk. He actively courted it, seemingly without reading the briefing book on what would happen if he pushed our neighbors too far. I want you to picture the meetings that must have happened inside the West Wing leading up to this. We know, based on how the Pentagon operates, that career officials, the logistics experts, the acquisition generals would have flagged this vulnerability. They would have had charts and spreadsheets showing exactly how dependent the F-35 program is on Canadian suppliers. They would have said, Mr. President, if you start a trade war with Canada, we have a single point of failure here, here, and here. But this administration has a documented history of ignoring technical expertise in favor of political optics. They operate on the belief that economic leverage is absolute. That because the US economy is 10 times the size of Canada's, we hold all the cards. That is the logic of a bully in a schoolyard, not a statesman in a global economy. Trump looked at the trade balance and saw numbers he didn't like, so he swung a hammer. He didn't understand that he was swinging that hammer inside a glass house filled with his own military hardware. This is what happens when you view economics purely through the lens of grievance and branding, rather than systems and supply chains. You end up sanctioning yourself. You end up grounding your own Air Force to own the libs, or in this case, to own the cucks. And let's look at the other side of the table. Mark Carney is not a novice. He's a former central banker, a man who understands the plumbing of the global financial and industrial systems better than almost anyone in Washington. When he made this move, it wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a calculated precision strike. He knew exactly which parts to block to cause maximum pain with minimum cost to the broader Canadian economy. He targeted the Pentagon because he knew it was the one place where Trump couldn't spin his way out of the problem. You can spin a bad jobs report. You can't spin a fighter jet that physically cannot take off. Carney effectively called the bluff of the America First doctrine. He demonstrated that in an A-worked world, isolationism is just another word for vulnerability. Now consider the panic this has triggered inside the Department of Defense. I want you to imagine being a general right now, responsible for the readiness of the U.S. Air Force. Your job is to make sure we can fight a war tonight if we have to. And suddenly, you are told that because of a tariff dispute over steel and dairy, you cannot get the actuators for your landing gear. You are furious. Reports are leaking out that the Pentagon is effectively at war with the White House on this issue. They are screaming that national security must take precedence over trade protectionism. But the White House is stuck. If they back down now, Trump looks weak. He looks like he surrendered to Canada. If they don't back down, the jets stay grounded and the military rots. They have painted themselves into a corner with their own rhetoric, and the only way out is to admit they were wronged. Something this president is chemically incapable of doing. This internal chaos is not staying behind closed doors. The world is watching. And this brings us to the most dangerous aspect of this entire debacle: the geopolitical signal it sends. While Washington and Ottawa are bickering, Beijing and Moscow are taking notes. Xi Jinping is looking at this and realizing that the American military supply chain is incredibly brittle. He is seeing that he doesn't need to defeat the U.S. Navy in open combat. He just needs to disrupt the flow of specialized components. If Canada, our closest ally, can our readiness with a few signatures on export permits, what could a hostile power do? What happens if China decides to restrict exports of rare earth minerals essential for our guidance systems? We are practically advertising our jugular vein to our adversaries. George Will was right to call this a geopolitical disaster. It shatters the illusion of American omnipotence. For decades, the world assumed that the U.S. military was a self-sufficient, unstoppable force. Now they see it for what it really is: a complex, fragile system dependent on the goodwill of allies. Allies that we are currently alienating. We are showing the world that the United States is an unreliable partner and an incompetent hegemon. If we can't even manage a trade relationship with Canada without disarming ourselves, how can we be trusted to manage the security of Taiwan or Ukraine? The irony is almost too much to bear. The administration that shouted the loudest about peace through strength has delivered us chaos through incompetence. They have weakened the military not by cutting the budget, but by cutting the lifelines that keep the machinery running. And notice how the tough on China crowd is suddenly very quiet about this. They spent years warning us about supply chain dependencies on our rivals, but they completely ignored the dependencies on our friends. They took the alliance for granted. They assumed Canada was just a vassal state that would make our parts and shut up. Now they are learning the hard way that in capitalism, nobody is a vassal if they own the means of production for something you desperately need. As we look at the fallout, we have to ask, who is going to fix this? The White House is currently threatening to use the Defense Production Act to force companies to prioritize these orders. But again, that law stops at the border. They are talking about reshoring production, about building these factories in America. That sounds great in a campaign speech. But do you know how long it takes to build a high-precision aerospace foundry, staff it with engineers who have 20 years of experience, and get every single bolt and valve certified by the FAA and the DoD? It takes years. We don't have years. We have a crisis right now. The president has created a gap between his political desires and economic reality, and the US military has fallen right into it. This is a failure of governance on a historic scale. It is a failure to understand the basic interconnectedness of the modern world. And it is a failure that falls squarely on the shoulders of Donald Trump and his trade advisors. They thought they were playing 40 chess, but they didn't even realize they were playing Jenga. They pulled the wrong block, and now the tower is wobbling. In the next section, we need to talk about the wider consequences of this, because the damage goes far beyond just a few grounded jets. We are talking about the erosion of trust in the American dollar, the American contract, and the American promise of security. This is how empires start to crack.